So we're going to try and make some changes to the arms now. We're going to begin by cutting a negative space in the forearm using the mesh, the insert sphere. Hold down Alt while you draw the sphere. So you hold down the Alt key, click and drag, and it looks like it's going to add the sphere just like normal. However, what's going to happen is the volume of the sphere, instead of being added to the arm, will be subtracted. That's once you execute the dynamesh. So I'm just going to use transpose to position this in place. And I'm just trying to look for ways to make the silhouette of this character more interesting, and cutting out negative spaces where you wouldn't expect to see them is one way of doing that. It's very, unusual to see a negative space cut through a living character's arm like this. You would see that between the radius and the ulna bones, but I thought it would be really interesting to be able to see through the arm. This is actually something that I end up abandoning later in the design. I fill this shape in with another volume, which I think is more successful, but the form that we create right now is still valid. It's still important to the final design. And what I'm basically doing is positioning the volume that I want to subtract. Remember, the sphere that you see here in a moment will be taken away. We'll execute the dynamesh now, and it'll think about it. You can see it processing at the top of the screen. And then in just a moment, it will complete, and we will have a negative space cut through, just like you see there. And now we'll smooth that with the smooth brush. And don't get caught up in trying to add too many details or anything. I'm going to inflate this a little bit just to thicken it up, so it's got a little bit more meat and volume to it. Now I want to make some changes to the hands. I don't want it to be just a normal human hand with 5 fingers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate the fingers so basically they're intersecting with each other in 2 large appendages rather than 5 finger appendages. So basically I'm just using the transpose rotate tools to spread the fingers out and then merge them together. As you can see here, I'll just rotate the ring finger and shift it over towards the pinky finger. There we go. The idea is I want to reconfigure this human hand into a creature hand that has 2 large finger appendages and a thumb. So I'm inflating those fingers so they're intersecting. Now remember, when I dynamesh, anything that's intersecting will be removed. So basically those fingers that I'm blobbing together right now will become a single appendage once it's dynameshed. So you can see I'm dynameshing now. And those fingers have become one. I'll blob these together again, just using the inflate brush just to inflate them together. And then I'm going to use the transpose move tool to stretch these fingers out a bit. And then just use the move brush to adjust the gesture of these finger appendages. Give a sense of there being joints in there. So here we've executed another dynamesh, and now I can smooth down all the little nooks and crannies left over from the original hand, or the original fingers. We've got 2 nice big alien appendages there in place of those original fingers. And there's quite a bit more sculpting that we'll do on these, but I'm just trying to fundamentally change the forms now. I'm going to enlarge the thumb too so it matches up with the scale of those other appendages, those other 2 fingers. And just using transpose move. At this stage I want to repose the arms, and I'm doing that just using the transpose rotate and transpose move brushes. And some of this geometry here that we've built into the chest area, this is going to become damaged when we start reposing the arms. And I'll try and preserve as much of it as I can, but I might let some of that go away in the interest of changing the configuration of the shoulder and arm positioning here, just so it works better and it gives me a more interesting character pose. I'm really going to go for something that feels like it's about to spring, that's got a lot of malicious intent. I'm unmasking the shoulder blades, trying to experiment with, as I pose this, if I can maintain some of the anatomy there in the shoulder blades, see if I can't pull those back from the back a little bit, and give a more interesting shape language to the back. You see, I'm just looking for the best rotation. Masking down to the elbow now so we can bend that forearm forward. I want to enlarge the hands a bit. I want the hands to be really big because I want those claws to be really imposing. There we go. So you can see I'm trying to create a sense of almost like a praying mantis. I want a very insectoid feeling to these arms. And you can see that I was able to preserve those negative spaces up under the shoulder muscles there. So that's positive. And I was able to preserve the back muscles that you can see in the upper left-hand corner of the screen there. Now at this stage I'm just using the standard brush to carve in the suggestion of some exoskeletal plates, because I know that a lot of the parts of this character I'm going to have covered in a bit of armor. These mandibles I actually created while the video was paused. They were just created out of spheres that were appended in as subtools. Just a very simple shifting of polysphere into a mandible shape. So I'm using the clay tubes brush now to start to suggest the bony anatomy of these fingers. I don't want to make sure that I've got a sense of there being structural anatomy there before I put any sort of detail down. And I want to flatten out the undersides and create some kind of finger pads here and fill in these collapsed areas at the back of the shoulders. These are areas that got deformed heavily when I was posing, so I want to reintroduce a sense of there being anatomy, there being muscular connections between the arms and the shoulder blades here. I'm just using the transpose mask tool to mask out the body so I can shift the arms out a little bit and give some clearance there between the torso and the arms themselves, just so I can get some nice negative space shapes in there in the silhouette. And I'm just using the move brush to again think about these plates running down the abdomen. So I am aware at this point that I want to have some really interesting exoskeletal forms running down the length of the body, so I just keep revisiting that area and suggesting them as I work. Going back in with some more tendons running down the neck using the curved tube brush. And I'm adjusting the flow of the curve after each stroke. And executing a dynamesh now to merge those strokes into the body volume. Now smoothing those back with a smooth brush. I'll give some more attention to the muscles of the back here. I definitely want to resolve these areas of the back, but right now I've still got the scapulas in there and some suggestions of the muscles, and at this point I want to really give the impression that there are muscular attachments from the scapula running up to these big massive arms, these long arms. And I'm suggesting the rhomboid muscles here that run from the inside border or medial border of the scapula towards the center of the spine. There we go. We don't have to overstate everything. I can just suggest some of these forms. Not everything has to be really, really specific, especially at the back of the figure right now. Our main focus is really the front view. but I don't want to leave the back unfinished by any stretch. I definitely want everything resolved up to a point. Starting to add some striations in between the muscles of the deltoid, or the heads of the deltoid muscles here, and using the trim dynamic brush to add some planes. You know, some parts of this character I'm actually going to have look rather rigid, almost like a hard surface, because it's exoskeletal. So I'm using the trim dynamic brush to sort of rough in those planes and those hard areas, those shells. So we're going to append a polysphere in now, which is an eyeball. And we use the transpose scale and move tools to scale this down and place it in the eye socket. We want to get the size and the placement just right. I'm just using transpose to move that into position. And once I've got the eyeball in the correct position, I'll go over to the geometry menu and I'll delete any other subdivision levels. I just want one subdivision level, so I'll delete the lower levels, and that's going to allow me to use that control click drag tool. Remember, if you hold down control and then click and drag the center circle of the transpose line, it'll duplicate the object. So I'm able to duplicate these eyes all the way up the length of the head and place them in each eye socket. Now once I'm happy with each of those eyes being in position, I'll go to the Z plugin menu and use the subtool master to mirror those eyes across the x-axis. So now I've got the eyeballs in place and the heads are starting to look quite a bit more intimidating now. Now I'm using the curved tube brush to create some little tendrils along the back of the head. Before we're done, we're actually going to put quite a few tendrils back here to suggest hair and silhouette. They're going to look like tendrils or tentacles or some type of appendages, feelers, but in silhouette they will be suggestive of big chunky bits of hair or dreadlocks. So it's going to be a really interesting effect in the later design. So moving on now, I'm using the clay tubes brush to create some bone anatomy, some skeletal anatomy here in the hands, and creating the fleshy fat pads on the palms. I'm also switching over to the standard brush here and making some diagonal strokes. And this is to start to suggest skin stretching over those bony landmarks that I sculpted in. Now I won't take these wrinkles to a finish now. I'm just suggesting them in a very rough phase, because it's the way that I tend to work, is I work the entire figure at one time, roughing it all in at various degrees of detail. So by the end, I've worked everything up to the same level of finish. So here I'm going to use the curved tube brush to create a claw, a long needle-sharp claw for the thumb. And I want the claws on this character to be really, really intimidating looking. And there's going to be very big talons coming off of these hands. That's really the main feature in terms of this character's aggressive quality. It's the hands. Those big claws on these hands should really be intimidating looking. And then the pose that we've got the character in it's very sprung. It really feels like it's about to leap into action, so it's nice to have these big claws presented as something dangerous. So I'm just carving away in between the wrinkles here just to deepen them so it really feels like very desiccated skin stretched over bone. and saving our work. Now coming into the underside of the palms here, I'm going to build up the fleshy pads of the fingers. I want it to feel like there's their anatomical forms here intended for gripping. Little segmented fatty pads on the undersides of the fingers. Just adds another level of realism, another level of detail, so it feels like all of these surfaces and all these forms have a purpose. So I'm actually going to reevaluate these negative spaces in the forearm now. I'm going to use the insert sphere brush, and I'm basically going to insert again the same volume that I used to subtract out that negative space. But what I'll end up with now is the appearance of there being like a soft fleshy form nested inside of an exoskeletal structure in the forearm. While I liked the negative spaces there, I feel like it undermined the structural integrity of the forearm and made it feel weaker. So now I'm going to be able to sort of contrast two different surfaces, a softer muscular internal form against the two bands of that more rigid-looking outer form. So it still creates a very interesting shape, and I'm glad that we used the negative subtraction earlier in the sculpting process, but in terms of the final design, I don't feel like that negative space works, whereas the negative space in the muscles of the shoulders do work. Filling out the collapsed areas at the elbow using the clay tubes brush here, and starting to suggest some of the anatomical shapes of the elbow. Moving up the backs of the arms. I'm just using the move brush to add a little bit of nuance to some of these shapes. Revisiting the plates again, and I'm using masking to mask out the plates so I can use the move brush to tug them out and over each other and give a really nice sharp delineation there, so it feels like they are exoskeletal segments which are overlapping each other. It's really kind of gross in a great way. So that really nice hard shadow there helps. And just using the standard brush now to create some nice striations there, so it feels like furrows in the shell, like you might find on the back of a crab shell or any crustacean. Now I'm picking out lots of little pieces of shadow here, just little pock marks in between the bits of flesh on the hands or in between the plates on the chest. That's what adds interest, is that contrast between highlight and deep shadow. And by picking out those recessed areas, I'm able to capture areas of deep shadow. And revisiting the pads of the fingers here as well. Eventually we're going to have big stingers coming out of the fingertips there, so it'll be a really nice intimidating claws, but right now I just want to create the sense of there being a gripping surface here. So I'm just building up these pads using the clay tubes brush. It's a very rough and simple approach. There we go. Adding more little bits of striations of flesh, little stretchy bits of skin draped over these appendages. I'm trying to build up the form where it's where the form is unsuccessful, where it's a little bit collapsed. I'm trying to mass it out and build it up using the clay tubes brush. I'm using the visibility tool to isolate the hand so I can get to the palm easier. I'm just using clay tubes again to build up these gripping surfaces. And you can see that I work really roughly and quickly. I mean, this is time-lapsed by 200%, so I don't actually sculpt this fast, but I do tend to sculpt quickly without sacrificing accuracy. I just try not to sort of harangue over each stroke. I just try and get an idea of where I want to be and move the clay and continually move the figure. And I think that's really important, to keep the figure in motion while you're working. I'm using the trim dynamic brush now to flatten down these pads on the undersides of the fingers. I want them to feel like they're firm surfaces. and stretching that thumb out, and then bending it at the first joint just so it matches up a little bit better with the proportion of the other fingers, those other two appendages. I don't want too stubby of a little thumb there, it'll start to look humorous. We want it to feel rather intimidating. So I'm just continuing to use the move in the standard brush to adjust the shapes of the underlying skeletal anatomy and the flesh stretching over those forms. We're coming up on the end of this video now, and I'll see you in the next video, and we're actually going to start creating some stingers, some appendages coming off the back of this character. And to do that, we're going to be using Z-spheres in conjunction with connector meshes and local meshes. So it's actually a really cool technique that allows us to create really nice segmented sort of scorpion tails. So after I make some changes here, like to the scapulas, using the move brush, and make some more minor changes to the figure, we'll move on to the next video, and I'll see you there.